They called him the greatest liar in history. A deception so perfect, so utterly convincing, it fooled Adolf Hitler and changed the fate of World War II. But few know the man who pulled it off. He was a Spanish chicken farmer, a nobody with no training, and arguably the most brilliant double agent the world has ever seen. They called him Garbo. He created an entire phantom spy network from nothing but imagination. He played both the Nazis and the British, weaving lies so intricate that even his handlers couldn't always separate truth from fiction. He received medals from both sides of the war, and neither knew his true allegiance. The man who convinced the Führer to make his greatest mistake and saved thousands of Allied lives on D-Day. But how did an ordinary civilian outsmart an entire military intelligence agency? And what drove him to risk everything for a war that wasn't even his to fight? This is the story of Juan Pujol García, the real-life master of deception who changed history. Juan Pujol García was born on February 14, 1912, in Barcelona, Spain. Nothing about his early life suggested greatness. He came from a middle-class family, the son of a textile factory owner. He drifted through various jobs, managing a poultry farm, working in his father's business, and generally living an unremarkable existence. But beneath this ordinary exterior burned an extraordinary hatred for totalitarianism. During the Spanish Civil War, Pujol witnessed the brutality of both fascist and communist forces. He saw innocent people caught between ideological extremes, and it disgusted him. When World War II erupted and Nazi Germany began its conquest of Europe, Pujol felt a moral obligation to act. The problem was simple. He was nobody. No military training, no intelligence background, no connections whatsoever. Most people would have accepted their powerlessness. Juan Pujol García was not most people. In January 1941, Pujol walked into the British Embassy in Madrid and offered his services as a spy against Nazi Germany. The British, perhaps understandably, rejected him outright. They saw what everyone else saw: a civilian with no credentials, no access to secrets, and no apparent value. But Pujol had an idea so audacious, it bordered on madness. If the British wouldn't hire him, he would get hired by the Germans, prove his worth, and then approach the British again with something valuable to offer. It was a plan that could easily get him killed. He did it anyway. In early 1941, Pujol approached the German Abwehr with an offer to spy for the Reich. Unlike the British, the Germans were interested. They saw a Spanish civilian who expressed pro-Nazi sympathies and claimed he could travel to Britain to gather intelligence. The Abwehr gave him a crash course in espionage techniques, invisible ink, secret writing, and codes. They assigned him the codename Arabelle and sent him on his way with instructions to establish himself in Britain and begin sending reports. There was just one enormous problem that the Germans didn't know about. Pujol had no intention of actually going to Britain. Instead, he moved to Lisbon, Portugal, and began one of history's most elaborate frauds. From a modest apartment in Lisbon, armed with a blue guide to England, a map of Britain, reference books from the public library, and newsreel footage he watched at cinemas, Pujol began fabricating intelligence reports. He claimed to have arrived in Britain and to be recruiting a network of sub-agents across the country. His first reports were amateurish. He made obvious mistakes that any person actually in Britain would catch immediately. He reported that Glaswegians would do anything for a liter of wine, not knowing that Scots preferred whiskey and didn't measure in liters. He claimed Portuguese escudos were British currency in his expense reports. But he mixed these errors with enough accurate information gleaned from newspapers and guidebooks that the Germans remained interested. More importantly, Pujol began creating fictional sub-agents. Each had a detailed backstory, personality, and motivation for betraying Britain. There was a Portuguese traveling salesman, a Swiss businessman, a Venezuelan student who hated the British. Pujol gave them names, addresses, and personal problems. He made them feel real. By late 1941, British intelligence noticed something strange happening. The Germans were acting on information about Britain that was partially accurate, but also bizarrely wrong. MI5 began investigating and traced the source to someone in Lisbon who was clearly not actually in Britain. When they identified Pujol, they faced a fascinating dilemma. Here was a man who had done something almost impossible. He had gained the trust of German intelligence entirely through his own initiative, with no training and no help. His network of fictional agents was absurd, but it was also brilliant. If properly managed, it could become a devastating weapon of deception. In April 1942, the British finally brought Pujol to England and placed him under the control of MI5's double-cross system. His new handler was Thomas Harris, an art dealer turned intelligence officer. Together, they would transform Pujol's amateur operation into the most successful double-agent network in history. The British codenamed him Garbo, after the famous actress Greta Garbo, because he was the greatest actor in the world. The Germans continued to know him as Arabelle, their prize agent in Britain. Neither side knew the full truth, and that was exactly how Pujol wanted it. Under Harris's guidance, Garbo's network exploded in size and sophistication. What had been a handful of fictional agents became a sprawling organization of 27 different sub-agents, each with meticulous cover stories and personalities. Agent 1 was the Portuguese commercial traveler who served as Garbo's deputy and recruited many others. Agent 2 was a Swiss-German businessman in Boodle with access to shipping information. Agent 3 was a Venezuelan student in Glasgow, characterized as loud-mouthed and indiscreet, but fiercely anti-British. Agent 4 was stationed in Gibraltar. Agent 5 was in Canada. There was even Agent 7-4, described as a guard at a military installation, and Agent 7-7, a former seaman whom Garbo characterized as a thoroughly undesirable character. The genius of this network was its diversity and apparent independence. Each agent had access to different types of information and different geographic areas. When multiple agents reported similar information from different perspectives, it seemed to confirm the intelligence independently. Garbo and Harris developed elaborate systems for managing this phantom network. They created personality quirks and personal dramas. Agents got sick, had family problems, demanded more money, and occasionally needed to be fired for incompetence. One agent even died, and Garbo sent a heartfelt message to Berlin mourning the loss. The Germans bought every word. They increased Garbo's funding dramatically, sending him the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars. They promoted him within their internal rankings and praised his network as one of the most valuable intelligence assets the Reich possessed. What they didn't realize was that every strategic piece of information, every crucial detail, was carefully crafted by British intelligence to support Allied objectives. Garbo sent over 300 letters and 1,500 radio messages to the Germans during the war. The vast majority contained accurate but harmless information designed to build credibility. But buried within this mountain of mundane intelligence were carefully placed deceptions that would change the course of history. By early 1944, the Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The success of the invasion depended on surprise and deception. If the Germans knew where the Allies would land, they could concentrate their forces and potentially repel the invasion with catastrophic consequences. The challenge was immense. You cannot hide the preparation of the largest amphibious invasion in history, but you can hide where it's going. Enter Operation Fortitude, the deception plan designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would target Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel, rather than Normandy. The operation involved dummy tanks, fake landing craft, false radio transmissions, and controlled leaks of misinformation. Multiple double agents participated, but at the center of the web was Agent Garbo. His network began reporting massive troop concentrations in southeastern England, directly across from Pas-de-Calais. His agents described the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a completely fictional army supposedly commanded by General George Patton. The Germans knew Patton as America's most aggressive general, and naturally assumed he would lead the main invasion. Everything Garbo reported confirmed this assumption. But the most critical moment was yet to come. The invasion was scheduled for June 6, 1944. The challenge for Garbo was delicate. If he said nothing about the Normandy invasion, the Germans might suspect his network had been compromised. If he warned them too early, he could jeopardize the entire operation. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity and timing. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, at approximately 3 a.m., hours before Allied forces hit the beaches, Garbo sent an urgent message to his German handlers. His agents had noticed unusual activity. Large-scale troop movements were underway. An invasion appeared imminent. He didn't specify where, but the implication was clear. Something big was about to happen. Due to a combination of timing and German bureaucratic failures, this message didn't reach the relevant military commanders until after the Normandy landings had already begun. To the Germans, it appeared that their best agent had tried to warn them, but their own incompetence had prevented them from acting on his intelligence. This actually increased their trust in Garbo rather than diminishing it. But the real masterstroke came 3 days later. On June 9th, while German commanders were frantically trying to determine whether Normandy was the main invasion or merely a diversion, Garbo sent a long, detailed message that would seal the fate of Nazi Germany. After careful analysis of reports from his entire network across Britain, Garbo concluded that the Normandy invasion was a feint. The main invasion, he insisted, was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. The force that landed in Normandy was substantial, yes, but the real threat remained Patton's Fusag, which his agents reported was still positioned in southeastern England, preparing for the decisive blow. This message was perfectly timed and perfectly crafted. The Germans were desperate for clarity, and Garbo provided it with absolute conviction. His report went up the chain of command all the way to Hitler himself. The Führer, already predisposed to believe Pas-de-Calais was the real target, accepted Garbo's analysis completely. He ordered that the 15th Army, stationed to defend Pas-de-Calais, should remain in position rather than reinforce Normandy. The decision to keep the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais was catastrophic for Nazi Germany. This force consisted of 19 divisions, hundreds of thousands of troops, and substantial armored units that could have pushed the Allies back into the sea during the vulnerable early days of the invasion. Instead, they sat waiting for an invasion that would never come. For 6 critical weeks after D-Day, German High Command continued to believe the main attack was still pending at Pas-de-Calais. During this time, the Allies established an unbreakable foothold in France, built up their forces, and began the liberation of Western Europe. By the time the Germans realized they had been deceived, it was far too late. Military historians have analyzed this deception extensively and reached a stunning conclusion. Garbo's intelligence was the single most important factor in convincing Hitler to withhold reinforcements from Normandy. Without this deception, the D-Day invasion might have failed, or at minimum would have cost tens of thousands more Allied lives, and delayed the liberation of Europe by months or even years. One man, sitting in London, typing false reports based on fictional agents, had changed the outcome of the largest military operation in human history. The chicken farmer from Barcelona had outsmarted the entire German military intelligence apparatus and fooled the Führer himself. The Germans, still completely unaware they had been deceived, awarded Agent Garbo the Iron Cross Second Class in July 1944. This was one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors, typically reserved for combat heroism and exceptional service to the Reich. The medal couldn't be physically delivered, obviously, so it was awarded via radio message. Garbo accepted with appropriate expressions of gratitude and continued loyalty to the Nazi cause. Meanwhile, in November 1944, the British awarded Juan Pujol García, the member of the Order of the British Empire, for his extraordinary service to the Allied war effort. To this day, he remains the only person in history to have received military honors from both Nazi Germany and the Allied forces. Even after D-Day secured Allied victory in Europe, Garbo's work continued. He maintained his correspondence with German intelligence until the very end of the war in May 1945. His final messages expressed dismay and confusion at Germany's defeat, with subtle hints that he might continue working for German interests in the post-war world. This ensured the Germans never suspected they had been deceived. This was crucial for 2 reasons. First, it protected Garbo himself from potential Nazi retribution. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it prevented the Germans from learning how thoroughly their entire intelligence network in Britain had been compromised. The double-cross system had controlled virtually every German agent in Britain, turning them into tools of Allied deception. If the Nazis had discovered this before the war ended, the intelligence implications could have been severe. When the war ended, Pujol faced an uncertain and dangerous future. Despite Germany's defeat, there were legitimate concerns that die-hard Nazis might seek revenge against those who had betrayed the Reich. British intelligence decided the safest course was to make Juan Pujol García disappear. In 1949, MI5 orchestrated an elaborate deception, one final con for the master of deception. They spread rumors that Garbo had died of malaria while living in Angola. Obituaries were planted, records were altered, and the story was accepted as fact. Juan Pujol García officially ceased to exist. In reality, Pujol had relocated to Venezuela, where he lived quietly under an assumed name. He opened a bookstore in Caracas and later worked in various business ventures. For nearly 4 decades, he lived in complete anonymity. The world believed he was dead. Even his own children didn't know about his wartime activities. He had saved thousands of lives and helped win the greatest war in history, but he couldn't tell anyone. Occasionally, Pujol felt frustrated that his contribution wasn't recognized, that history had forgotten him. But he understood that secrecy was the price of survival, and he had made peace with that bargain.